Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. On this show, we discuss all aspects of executive compensation. Whether you're a compensation committee member, a seasoned compensation professional, or just curious to learn more about executive compensation, then this show is the answer. Each episode brings you a focused and actionable interview on specific topics of executive compensation. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com. Today we are talking about using discretion effectively in your annual incentive plan. And so can you maybe give a quick high-level overview of just this topic, maybe why this is important, just any kind of overall context here to begin?
Yeah, I think historically, many bonus plans have been very formulaic in nature. You create a payout scale based on that. There'll often be a threshold goal and a target goal and a maximum goal. And so at the end of the year, you just do a straight calculation and that's going to create what the level of payout will be underneath the incentive plan. What we're seeing for a lot of companies is that often you get to the end of the year, particularly if you think about the kind of year that we had in 2020, and then what spits out from that formula doesn't feel right. There's just been some noise during the year. There's been things that have happened during the year that you didn't anticipate when you set the goals. And so it creates challenges when you've got to approve the payouts just strictly based on the formula. And what we have many clients that have done, and we're seeing more clients consider, is incorporating some level of discretion in their plans so that the compensation committee can use some judgment at the end of the year to evaluate really how was the performance of the executive team and what are the appropriate payouts that would reflect that.
Okay. Makes sense. So to make sure I understand effectively, so when you talk about discretion, you're saying that discretion is like a addition to a plan saying, here's the structure, but there's almost like this variable amount that the board can almost like vote on or adjust at the end of the year. Is that accurate? Or
I think that's one approach. There's actually a couple different ways that companies can do it. We do have clients that have fully discretionary plans, and they will have a set of priorities and goals and objectives that they're going to look at, but they have at the end of the year, they have full discretion to say, okay, based on those results, based on how you did through the year, we're going to determine what we think the right payout is. But there's also approaches that would say we're going to have a formula and that's going to determine an initial payout level, but then we're going to reserve the right to use some discretion and judgment to potentially adjust that amount up or down.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, that's super helpful. Anything else at like a high level foundation before we dive into some of these other questions?
Maybe the other thing I would just say is often discretion can get a little bit of a bad rap because it just feels to some observers that at the end of the day, the committee can just do whatever they want and they can use it as a justification for paying higher bonuses than would have otherwise been earned. And you can certainly find examples of that, but where it really works well is where there is a lot of structure behind it. And so even though it relies on judgment for the final decision, there's a lot of facts that go into guiding the committee into what the right decision is.
Okay. Perfect. So then I guess we'll dive into some of these questions then. So what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to including discretion in an annual incentive plan?
Yeah, I think one of the big advantages is that it really gives the compensation committee the opportunity to take a more holistic view of performance. Part of that is not just evaluating what was achieved, but how it was achieved. Are the results going to be sustainable? Have they set you up to have success going forward in future years? And the other piece that can really come into play there is, did the company accomplish some of the strategic priorities that it had for the year? Oftentimes there are things that you're trying to do from a longer term strategic perspective that may not show up in the annual financials and frankly may even harm the annual financials, but they're going to be important to the long-term success of the organization. And so having the ability to use some discretion gives the opportunity for the committee to evaluate that. Now, the second advantage that I would say is it's a recognition that when the goals are set, there's imperfect information. And I think if you think about 2020 and everybody that set goals in January or February of 2020, and then just saw how drastically all of those assumptions that went into those goals got blown out of the water. It's just a reflection that often there can be a lot that happens through the course of the year that's pretty difficult to capture when you're setting the goals, and it may be appropriate to adjust based on whatever headwinds or tailwinds occur during the course of the year. On a disadvantage perspective, I think there's maybe two things that I would mention. One is that it does create a level of uncertainty for both the executives and for directors as well, in that there isn't this nice, neat calculation that's going to spit out an answer for everybody to be comfortable with at the end of the year. And so with that, there's got to be a level of trust between the executives and the directors that you're going to get to the right answer at the end of the day. And so it means that executives have to trust that the board will come to the right answer, and it also means that the directors have to be willing to use that judgment and not just take whatever answer a formula is going to give them. And then the other disadvantage I would mention is with proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis, they're on record as not liking the use of discretion in plans. And so where you do have more discretionary plans, you're more at risk of getting pressure on your say on pay vote relative to how the proxy advisors may react to your plan design.
Great, that's super helpful. And so why have more companies been incorporating discretion into their 2021 plans?
I think for many companies, 2020 just revealed the challenges of purely formulaic plans. Many plans, as we talked about, had a lot of assumptions built into them that just proved to be very inaccurate as 2020 went on. And then even as we head into 2021, we're still in an environment that has a lot of uncertainty behind it, a lot of potential volatility in the results from that. And that's given companies a chance to really think through whether or not the formulaic approach has really served them well or not, or whether they should incorporate some more discretion within their plan. The other thing that 2020 revealed for many companies is just the need to evolve their strategy and transition into a new way of doing things. And so with that, often as we talked about, there are things that need to be done from a strategic standpoint that aren't necessarily going to show up in nice, neat, formulaic financial performance measures. And so creating some opportunity for discretion to evolve how those transformational efforts are going at the company can be an effective tool.
Great. And so what are different approaches to using discretion in an annual incentive plan?
Yeah, I would probably group them into three buckets. Somewhat as we had talked about earlier, there are plans that are fully discretionary. And that just says at the end of the year, we are going to evaluate results on a holistic basis, and we're going to determine what the appropriate payout may be. So there is typically a lot of structure underneath that, a lot of established goals that are going to drive where the right payout level is going to be. But ultimately, the committee does have the full discretion to determine the payout. The second approach that I would mention is more of a weighted component of the plan. So in this type of plan, you may say that 70% of the plan is going to be based on a formulaic earnings measure or other financial measures, but then you're reserving 30% to be based on more of a qualitative discretionary assessment against some key priorities. And then the last one that I would mention is more of what I would call a modifier approach. That's one where you have a formulaic plan that's going to create an initial payout level, but then the committee is reserving the right to exercise discretion to modify that amount up or down, again, typically based on some established criteria that you've made, but it will be a qualitative adjustment.
Great. And then next one would be, how can discretion be used effectively?
I think it's important if you are going to have a discretionary element of your plan that you really have a strong structure behind it. And so that means that at the beginning of the year, talking through what are going to be the parameters of that discretionary component of your plan. That means establishing what the key criteria are going to be. It means talking through what does a below target performance look like, what does an above target performance look like, and really working through at the end of the year what you're going to be discussing and what you're going to be looking at to determine the right payout level. It's really also very important that there is an openness and a trust between the executives and the compensation committee, particularly between the CEO and the committee, because if you do have a discretionary element, the committee is often going to be looking to the CEO to provide some recommendations there. And they have to be comfortable that the CEO is going to be transparent with them, give them a well thought out recommendation. And the CEO and the management team have to trust that the committee is going to reach a reasonable conclusion through that as well. And part of what helps that process is if you really discuss throughout the course of the year how things are going, and the closer you get to the end of the year, start talking about what it may mean from a payout perspective. If you wait until the year is over and then you talk about everything, there could be very different perspectives that come from the committee and from the management team that can make it difficult to reach the right conclusion. But if you're having that conversation about performance throughout the course of the year, then you start to narrow in on what the reasonable outcomes may be, and then you're well prepared to make that final decision at the year end. I think maybe the last thing that I would mention is that it's important for the compensation committee to really think through how the decisions that will be made will be perceived both internally within the organization as well as externally. Particularly with executive incentive payouts, those are going to be publicly disclosed. And so internally throughout the organization, other employees are going to see what those decisions are. They're going to evaluate it relative to what payouts they received under their incentive plans and how they viewed the year and the performance. And then externally, shareholders, the proxy advisory firms, they're going to be looking through the lens of how they viewed performance, and they're going to evaluate whether or not the payouts seem to align with that as well.
Great. And what are the disclosure implications when you incorporate discretion into your plan?
Now, clearly, ISS and Glass Lewis have indicated that they prefer formulaic incentive plans. And so if you are going to have a discretionary plan or discretionary components within your plan, you have to know going in that they are potentially going to have some negative reactions to that design element. What that often means is that if they run their quantitative pay for performance test and they view you as having pay and performance that are aligned, they may criticize the discretionary plan, but they're not necessarily going to recommend against your say on pay vote. However, you do have to know that if you fail their pay for performance test, you're at a much higher risk of getting an against say on pay recommendation. So you have to be willing to accept that possibility out front, but you can also prepare for that by making sure that you will disclose very clearly the rationale for your decision making. The more details you can give around the parameters that were used to evaluate performance and reach those conclusions will certainly be helpful, and really trying to build out a compelling rationale for the decisions that were made. I think as we think through and look at a lot of the statements that have come from some of the major institutional investors about how they're going to evaluate 2020 compensation programs, many of the institutions have indicated that they are open to the committees using judgment to figure out the right payout. They just want to make sure that the CD&A and the disclosures give the strong, compelling rationale for why those decisions were met. And so if you can provide that, then that gives the opportunity to tell your story and make it clear why you reached the decisions that you did.
Great. Any other kind of things that you want to add into the mix on this?
I don't know if I've got anything else in particular. I think that probably touched on most points.
And then another question I always like to ask you, if you had to summarize the kind of one key takeaway or like the key message of this article in just a couple sentences, what would that be? But
discretion is really a very valuable tool for compensation committees to be able to use their judgment to make sure that payouts are aligned with the performance of the organization. So it can be very useful to build that into your plans and to have that as a part of your incentive structures. But you do want to make sure if you do that, that you discuss that up front, that you establish what the criteria are that you will use to evaluate that, and that ultimately you ground your decisions in factual results that you can then be comfortable disclosing, tell your story of why you've made the decisions that you have.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. You can see more about this episode along with additional executive compensation insights at meridiancp.com. That's Meridian, the letter C, and the letter P.com. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com.